Welcome, everyone. I see a number of people are still joining. We're going to give people one more minute, turn the music back on, and then we'll start. Get yourself comfortable, grab a cup of coffee, or whatever your beverage of choice is. Be back in a minute. Good morning, good afternoon to some. Welcome, bienvenue. If we go to the next slide, please. Before we begin, my name is Carol Ann, and we'll do some proper introductions soon. I believe it's important to acknowledge that many of us are joining this virtual event from Canada on land that is the traditional, ancestral, and often unceded territory of a diversity of Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. The act of acknowledging the land and the signed treaties where applicable is an act of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's an expression of respect and gratitude for the land. This is to remind us that our places of work, where we live and where we gather, are on the traditional lands of Indigenous people who historically resided here and still presently do. I'd encourage you to take a moment to consider the connection you feel to the land from which you are joining our event today. And as you can see, there's a resource that we like to share called Native Land. We'll share the link to this in the chat as well, where you can go look at where you are based or travel to, and the connections with that land as well and its traditional people. I have the privilege to be joining you today from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, and the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis government of the Métis Nation within Alberta District 6, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you for joining us. What we're going to talk about today is current where we are. I'm going to present my colleagues, of course, first. Talk about where we are, why we're navigating uncertainty, and more so than maybe we have in the past. And now what? So what and now what? And what are we seeing different actors in society doing to deal with this? And then really bringing it back to you and how to make your journey more climate smart. We like to say making order out of chaos. And we're going to leave lots of time for questions. So with that, I'll share that I have the privilege of being the president of the Delphi Group. It's a great team across Canada. And I'll be joined today with some colleagues, Melissa Harris, who's our Senior Director of Policy, and Matt Beck, he's our Senior Director of Carbon Management and Sustainability. First, who we are. So Delphi's been around for 35 years and has been focused on delivering strategic consulting value, specializing in climate change, sustainability, and ESG. So that was way before sustainability was cool. And we've had the pleasure of working across Canada and overseas across all kinds of sectors and all levels of government. We are a purpose-led organization. We really believe in walking the talk. So we're a certified B Corporation, and we're part of a collective called Profoundry. It includes Globe Series, Canadian Business for Social Responsibility, and Leading Change Canada. And this really makes us the biggest platform for ESG performance in Canada. You can go to the next slide, please. With that, I'm delighted to be passing the mic to Melissa, who's going to talk about where we're at.
Great. Thank you so much, Cab. Okay, so I'll start with a quick overview of some of the sources of uncertainty and then talk about the areas where we expect to see momentum regardless of this uncertainty. Next slide, please. So we're hearing a lot about uncertainty, obviously, looming elections in the EU, in the US, and Canada, coupled with the precarious nature of current economic conditions, has really cast doubt on the future of the direction of climate action. So when we look at the upcoming elections, for example, in the European Union, those take place 6th to 9th of June. The new leadership will obviously shape climate policy until the end of the decade. And we know that this is a really crucial period for climate action. Some of the current polls are suggesting a significant shift to the right in many countries. If a majority emerges, there could be some opposition to the more ambitious EU action that we've seen in the past. There's also the US election coming up, obviously top of mind for lots of folks. So that's slated for November 5th. We're still in the middle of primaries and have conventions coming up in July, so things can always change. But already Trump has said that if he's elected, he'll pledge to reverse the Inflation Reduction Act, which most of you on the call will know as the largest package of domestic climate measures in US history. He's also made some statements about rolling back oil and gas regulations, EV mandates, doubling down on drilling, and withdrawing from international climate change negotiations. In the Canadian context, there's an election currently slated on or before October 20th of 2025. There's some speculation that this election could be called earlier, but given the current polling, the sitting government will likely try and hold off as long as possible. And there's a supply and confidence agreement in place with the NDP until the end of June 2025. So regardless of when the election happens, we do know that it's expected to be a climate election and a carbon tax election. Both the lead parties there have made it a central focus in the discussions so far. Aside from the axe the tax narrative, there's not a lot of additional detail from conservatives in terms of the planned approach to climate policy, but we are expecting to see some shift in priorities. In addition to the political uncertainty that I've just highlighted, there's obviously the lingering economic uncertainty. So full disclosure, I'm not an economist. I'm not going to speak in detail about these other elements, but just to say that they're top of mind for lots of folks. And obviously we're seeing analysis from BDC and major banks and other experts that the high interest rates, slower economic growth, and low consumer spending are continuing to have an impact and contributing to that overall feeling of uncertainty. So let's move to the next slide. So before we go any further, just wanted to get a sense from folks with a quick poll that we can launch. So I've mentioned some of the top considerations that we're hearing about, but just want to hear from folks in this anonymous poll what you're feeling the most uncertain about. So there's some listed here. There are others that you can include, but maybe we'll just give it a 10 or 20 seconds for folks to fill out the poll. And can we share the results when we have those as well? Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Lots of anxiety about the US election, which makes perfect sense. Federal Canadian up there as well. And then mixed messaging on climate priorities. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely hear those. Okay. So we're familiar with the sources of uncertainty, and there are others as well. But let's dig in because, in spite of this uncertainty, I do think that there are a number of elements that will continue to advance, a number of key drivers that we can expect to really continue momentum on the climate action agenda. So on the Canadian policy side, I'm not going to predict the future. I'm not in that business, but I do think that there are signs that we're seeing that some form of industrial carbon pricing is here to stay. And what I mean there, so I mentioned before that the narrative around getting rid of the consumer carbon tax has definitely been at the forefront of a number of discussions and appearing on in the news channels and debate in a way that I haven't seen before. But just to decipher and distinguish a bit there that, we're not hearing that same kind of criticism around industrial pricing specifically. So this approach of pricing large emitters has a long history of success in various provinces. It has been praised in different formats across different political parties. So Alberta is a great example of industrial carbon pricing surviving regardless of who forms government. The name of the policy might change and the details might change, but the fundamentals have remained. So when we layer that with some additional analysis that we're seeing by Canadian Climate Institute, for example, and others, is really showing that this market-based industrial policy is having the greatest impact on emission reductions going forward and a largest driver of progress between now and 2030 in terms of emission reduction targets. The other piece that I think bodes well for this specific policy is that as other countries are looking to implement carbon border adjustment measures and apply tariffs to embedded emissions of imported goods, industrial carbon pricing can really help to protect the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. So what I mean here is by pricing emissions domestically, it keeps this revenue in Canada, where the funds are potentially accessible for reinvestment through returns of proceed programs. So I know there are a number of different countries who are looking at carbon border adjustments. And so I think in this context, it also makes sense that the political parties are keeping this option for industrial carbon pricing on the table. Another driver that we see continuing is around net zero. So we do think that we'll see net zero commitments accelerate regardless of who's in power. Some thoughts here, when we look globally, 88% of emissions now, and I believe 92% of GDP are covered by net zero targets. And so a change in government isn't going to remove public pressure or international supply chain pressure to maintain progress on targets that have been announced. So a change in government isn't going to, relax that kind of pressure. Really to remain competitive and secure a place in this net zero future, I do see momentum around net zero targets continuing. Another key driver that we think will have continued momentum is around disclosures. So obviously the reporting landscape is continuing to move towards more transparency, more standardization of sustainability and climate related information through regulation to make disclosures mandatory. So obviously last month there was the Canadian Sustainability Standard Board released their proposed Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards to establish a benchmark for sustainability reporting in Canada. We have the CSA, the Canadian Security Administrators, using feedback from the consultations to inform their proposed rule for mandatory disclosures set for release later this year. There's OSFI, the Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions, also recently updating their guidelines, the B15 guideline, to align disclosure from federally regulated financial institutions with international standards. So, I mean, if you want more detail on this, there's lots happening in this space. My colleagues have just released an update to our ABCs of ESG guide, looking at disclosures, and so happy to share that if folks are interested in a deep dive there. We also, as I mentioned before, are expecting continued pressure from investors and other stakeholders to keep driving action. So many of you will have seen the, the landmark announcement around the European Court of Human Rights, siding with a group of citizens accusing the Swiss government of violating human rights by failing to address climate change. And this is setting a precedent for climate-related litigation and the legal duty to act on climate change. More broadly on the international front as well, do you think that that's going to continue to be a driver? None of the leaders of our main parties have directly spoken out against the Paris Agreement. And, that's a positive sign, I think, and safe to say that regardless, the international climate process will continue to be a driver. Countries are required to submit a new emission reduction target called a nationally determined contribution. The next round of those is to be submitted for 2025. And then there's a Canadian interim review that's required for 2026. And the next global stock take that happens internationally. This is where countries come together and report on their progress and, have accountability with each other against their goals. And that is scheduled for 2028. So you can see this mechanism where there's, target setting and reporting back, and that continues out for a number of years. So while we don't have a great track record under either government of meeting targets, the international process is specifically designed to ratchet up the level of ambition, and will continue to put pressure on whoever forms government to come forward with more targets and to really deliver on those commitments. And the other one I'll highlight here is just that adaptation will be increasingly important. So wildfire season has already begun in a number of provinces. It's expected to be even worse this year than last year, which seems impossible. And so, we'll continue to see the impacts of climate change. That happens regardless of who's in power. And we'll expect action to continue on adaptation and, perhaps under the National Adaptation Strategy, regardless going forward. Okay, so with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Matt to talk about what you can do in order to prepare. Thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. Hopefully my camera gets working here. Our tech team can hopefully start it for me. But while I'm okay, there we go. So yeah, Melissa highlighted a lot of different aspects of what we know is going to continue despite all this uncertainty. And for those of you who joined us in the fall on our previous webinar and on preparing for your climate smart journey and what you can do to navigate all the complexity of this landscape, this might be familiar to you, but quickly, I'll just review some of the things that are pretty universal. Like if we're trying to manage a climate action program within your business and make sure you're meeting the obligations that you need to for your business and your stakeholders, these things that, at a high level are laid out on this slide are relevant regardless of what's going on external to your business to one degree or another. So remember, if you joined us before, that the first step is really understanding where you're trying to go. What are your goals and what are and how do they connect with your purpose for your organization, your vision, your values, and how do you want to tell the story of your success in this space? Preparing for your journey in terms of understanding some of the basic underpinning features of your organization and its relationship with climate change, whether that be doing greenhouse gas inventories and screening, understanding who your stakeholders are and what kind of influence you might have with them, mapping out risks and opportunities related to that you might have, building your team properly, and ultimately preparing some of the business cases and resourcing that you can do, and moving from that into actually building out the plans and digging in deeper on risks and opportunities that are specific to some of those most important and high impact and influence areas. And then ultimately getting right down to where the rubber hits the road, and working towards your goals, meeting your objectives, measuring your progress, and talking about it. But we wanted to spend a little bit more time in this webinar talking with all of you about the preparation for the journey ahead in an era and in a time when we don't necessarily know all of the pieces of the puzzle. And so we don't know where the journey is going to take us. And so if we can move to the next slide, we can talk about some of the things that we can do right now that don't really care about who's in government or what policies might change, or the speed at which scrutiny on disclosure or other aspects of what we see happening externally might change. So one of the things, per Melissa's comments around momentum continues around targets for net zero, industrial carbon pricing being quite resilient, the march towards more mandatory disclosures, is if you haven't already done good, solid baseline greenhouse gas inventory work, that's always something that is a good investment to understand what the picture is for your organization and where you may be exposed. And that goes across your entire value chain. Obviously, some organizations will have a greater level of emissions and impact around the direct emissions associated with their operations or that of the energy they consume. Others, it might be more supply chain focused, right? If you are a retail shop, most of your emissions are going to be from getting the goods to your shop, less so from operating the shop, as an example. But it goes beyond that, in terms of spending the time to understand what are the risks that don't change and what are the areas that do change. And once you have a good picture of what those risks, opportunities, stakeholders, influence areas are, run some scenarios. If you've got some extra time and you're concerned that some of these political changes or other changes could impact your business in different ways, run some scenarios based on those areas of sensitivity. There's a lot of increasingly useful guidance every year, every month almost, coming from different groups that have that run through a lot of different scenarios on how to pick good cases for those scenarios, how to select data that is useful to your organization. And we've certainly done that with a lot of clients, and they found it incredibly helpful. Another aspect is when we get past the greenhouse gas inventory into how we're going to reduce, there's always time to sit down with your operations teams, with your business, with your employees, your staff, your suppliers, and identify new actions or refine actions. Cost them, think about what types of overlap there might be in different types of reduction opportunities that you might action, how your team is best situated to do that. And even, in some cases you can activate those, and especially kind of slam dunk, low risk, high return. If you've got exposure to industrial carbon pricing and that's not likely to change, actions that are related to mitigating that exposure are a great opportunity to continue advancing in light of uncertain times. If you know that you've got a supplier or a customer that really cares about you and your progress towards setting targets and progress towards meeting those targets, actions that help you demonstrate to that stakeholder that you are moving in the right direction towards a 2030 or later target are great opportunities to continue working. And that also goes hand in hand with the area that I see as having some of the most material short-term risks is when it comes to adaptation, particularly for businesses with physical assets in areas that have high impacts from climate change. Being able to move forward on planning and addressing those short-term risks is something that the climate isn't going to care who's in government, that he's sort of going to have to adapt. So that goes hand in hand with the rest of the risk, opportunity, and initiative activations that we've been talking about. On top of that all is the ever-present issue of disclosure, and it's all, there's always opportunities to enhance disclosure, but I want to encourage everyone to think about disclosure not just about putting out a good sustainability or climate report, but thinking about disclosure as how you engage with different stakeholders around the work that you're doing for climate. So that might include advocacy with multiple political parties to let them know what is a good policy that's working right now. If you've got something figured out, hey, don't mess with that. It would be great if we could keep this. It's working well for us. Letting them understand that so that they can do their planning. It might also be direct stakeholder engagement in the communities that you're working in around adaptation planning in collaboration with communities, maybe a whole host of other things beyond just publishing a good sustainability report. And that leads to the last thing that I think is really important to think about when we're doing this kind of work is, who do you want to work with? What's the team that you want to build, both internally or your staff, your contractors, etc., your favorite consulting firms that you might want to work with, or also other suppliers, customers, competitors that you might want to collaborate with as an industry to move some of these things forward. All of that is a great thing to think about now and as things are changing, because those relationships help us adapt as quickly as possible to the different external and market realities that we're facing right now. So on that note, we wanted to bring a poll forward to the audience here around what measures, in light of all this uncertainty, that you're thinking about advancing in the coming year or two in the face of all of this change. So please take a moment, write a couple answers. It's a short answer question. You don't have to be too detailed, and we'll try and share a few of those tidbits as we move into the next phase of this webinar, where we do some Q&A. So perhaps while everybody is filling that out, if we can move to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about some of the services that we've been focusing on lately with clients related to navigating uncertainty. As many of you are aware, we have services across many different aspects of sustainability and climate, including targeted services in innovation and clean tech as it relates to those, and green and circular economy. And when it comes to this, what we've been seeing a lot lately from the market and from our clients is a need to really answer that question around mandatory reporting and what are the policies and programs that impact different clients with operations in different jurisdictions with different stakeholders. So we've been doing a lot of work around mapping that out and understanding how to build out strong measurement and disclosure programs that feed the right information to the right people within the organization to make good decisions, and also feed into broader communications programs for other aspects of reporting, whether that be financial or otherwise. But also beyond that, we have seen in the last 2 years in particular a very large increase in the number of customer requests to our clients around supply chain type climate engagement. What kinds of information can you share with your customer? What kinds of targets may they want you to set? Many are being asked to pursue science-based targets, whether explicitly with the Science Based Targets Initiative or more or less formally. The process is quite similar in terms of doing the work to kind of map out where your baseline emissions are and where you need to be at a certain time frame in order to answer that. So we're seeing lots of work across those areas. And then that stems into action planning, where we look at building out ecosystems and matchmaking with solution providers, or opportunities to skill up your workforce and your employees and some of these things to tackle some of the new opportunities. So that is a great range of different projects that we're seeing lots of clients engage with us on, and we'd be happy to help in those. On that note, I think I'll hand it back to Carol Ann to take us into the Q&A portion.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you so much, Melissa. We found that there's always a gazillion questions, and so we want to provide as much time as possible, which is why we were super high level in what we've shared so far. And so I always have questions, and so while you warm up and put in your Q&A box, things that have puzzling you, or you want clarified, or you want to challenge our speakers today. I'm going to start. I'm going to have first call on questions, and I'll start with Matt. You gave a great list, Matt, of one thing after another. Here are things to consider doing. I don't imagine any of it is simple and quick and easy, but like, what kind of tools would you recommend for getting started? Where does one start?
Yeah, thanks, Carol Ann. I find that the tools question can be pretty contextual to every organization in terms of where they're at, what tools they have, and what's going to work for them in terms of their priorities. But there are a few common things that are very relevant regardless of organization. And one of those is spending some time early on to think about how you can manage the process of having to kind of always every year go back and report on some of these things, and think about how the data gathering problem is. I think, we often want to keep things as simple as possible, and our default is like, let's just open up a spreadsheet and start tracking some stuff, because we're all pretty familiar with it. But increasingly, we're seeing better and better tools that can really help with that integrate in with whether your organization uses Microsoft Teams or Slack or other communications channels. They integrate nicely with that, so that you can gather this information as seamlessly as possible and reduce the burden from asking a whole bunch of people in the organization for information while still being able to track it. So there's some increasingly great platforms for just basic, data collection and gathering and stewardship, all the way through to calculating when we're getting into the technical aspects of disclosure. But also, sometimes the simplest things are the best, and that's just having great relationship management, and using the tools that we use all the time, right? Like email and grabbing cups of coffee with people that you're going to need to ask for things when things change, right? Because a lot of this is like, we know a lot is going to change, and then down the road you're going to have to come back and ask them for a whole lot of new information. So I think the best tool that you can have in your toolbox is honestly just reaching out and building great relationships with people.
Yeah, well, kind of a lesson for life, right? Writ large. Thanks, Matt. We've gotten lots of questions. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to go to the next ones, but also remind you, if you want to add your question, at the bottom of the screen, in the Zoom, almost like ribbon, there's a Q&A icon that you can click on, and then you can type a question. I'm now going to go to Melissa, and ask around, some things seem to be set, other things seem to be changing. If there's going to be more change in terms of policies and standards, regulations, mechanisms to address climate change. You know, does it make sense to invest in a specific intervention when we don't know what the future holds? Or what are the specific interventions that are like, you know, the bare minimum that one should start with?
Yeah, fair enough. I'm not going to predict the future because that never bodes well for anyone. But what I would say there, in addition to what I've said about the industrial carbon pricing, you know, I do think that the narrative has been strong from all different political parties in the Canadian context around, you know, the support for the green economy, like that kind of language resonates regardless. Green projects has been used by all of the different political parties, a strong emphasis on technology, you know, the narrative around value chain and mining around critical mineral use, like those are areas that I think will advance regardless. Also, tax credits are always very popular regardless of who's in power. So I think you know, specifically about some of the tax credits that were recently highlighted again in the federal budget, including the carbon capture, utilization, and storage tax credit. I mean, that's an area where we'll continue to see progress, probably. The hydrogen tax credit, the clean technology manufacturing tax credit, clean electricity investment tax credit. Those I think are a safe bet to move actions in those spaces. And then otherwise, you know, I think we can just keep our ear to the ground in terms of the language that's being used and the types of policies that seem to be under target. But you know, depending on how things shake out, you know, obviously it looks very different if we end up with a minority government than with a majority government. And you know, if there is a change and there is a majority, you know, it still takes time to move processes through the system. So, you know, there'll be an emphasis on those items that were most highlighted during the election, and those that we haven't heard much about, you know, they take a lot of political capital, they take a lot of time. And so, you know, we might see changes to those filter on later on.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I'm going to go back to something Matt touched on and a question we have here around what's the best way to influence a company's stakeholders / tenants to reduce their emissions? So this is the scope 3 relationships and emissions. So I might get Matt to come back and answer that one.
Yeah, thanks, Cab. This is a great question, and I'm gonna sound at the risk of saying the same thing over and over again here. I don't think there is one best way to influence companies, whether there be stakeholders or tenants or other folks in the mix here that might change your scope 3 emissions footprint if they reduce their emissions. But there are a few good mechanisms, and it's why we see more and more of these kinds of customer requests coming through. Is they do make a difference when you join a program, whether it be something like the CDP supply chain or the Science Based Targets Initiative, or even do something similar on your own. When you start asking your tenants or or other stakeholders these kinds of questions, sometimes you're surprised at what you get back. Sometimes people start making commitments and they start doing things. Other times you might get some pushback. And that's where the second piece that we've definitely seen results work is, the bottom line matters. And so if you really want your tenants to do more to manage their energy footprint in your buildings, write it into the lease agreements, right? Build it into the commercial arrangements, whether it be carrots or sticks. As soon as it becomes legal, it becomes something that happens. Obviously that's a delicate balance and you have to think very carefully about what's the strategy there. But there's lots of great case studies out there and results that you can look to guide that.
Thanks. Might just stay on because the next question is also technical. around how do you see governance surrounding life cycle assessment and reporting changing to become more trustworthy? Oof, there's a lot packed in there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is an area that has been a challenge, and to some sectors, even more of a challenge than others. There's a lot of great established standards-based approaches to life cycle assessment. The ISO has some great standards. There's other guidelines out there as well, depending on the specifics of what you're trying to do. And so there is really good governance. You can do like a gold standard type approach where you get a panel and you do that. And for many companies selling, specific products where they need that kind of life cycle assessment, maybe to create an environmental product declaration because they want to be listed for procurement for different types of projects, things like that. That's a great option. That doesn't always fit the bill for everything though. And we see this especially in the energy sector where everybody's making carbon intensity claims for commodities that don't always align and aren't always comparable apples to apples. And so depending on the sector, and the needs of the specific claims and assessment that you're trying to do, you might have to look to one version or another. But there is a strong need for the industry for industries to come together and establish and agree upon good ways to compare. And unfortunately, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing there, but we're seeing more progress now than we ever have.
Is there a sector where it's clearer, like the guidance is clearer, and that would be perhaps an ideal to look to in terms of trying to standardize it for other sectors?
Yeah, I think when it comes to products, like goods, like we see a lot more in the and it like hard goods, physical products, or even textiles and things like that, or soft goods. We see some of that. I've seen great EPDs for agricultural products even. I saw a great example of one from an Italian pasta maker for their pasta, right? But it gets a little trickier when we get into like raw commodities, because people are trading them on markets and trying to differentiate based on these types of environmental performance using an LCA becomes a lot more fraught, because it's not this product versus that product. It's like, you're meeting a spec, and as long as you meet the spec, it's that commodity. And that's where I think we need to continue working a little bit further. And I've heard a lot of great examples of where that's starting to happen. But I would say that, this is an opportunity over the next 3 to 5 years where we see some more convergence.
Yeah. So I did want to go back to the last poll that we asked people to fill out, because we didn't do it for nothing. And we got some interesting answers around, what are the things that you're going to advance or continue to advance in the face of change, ranging from, circularity and working on reusable products and programs. On the service side, helping early companies take climate solutions to scale, to continue to focus on growing our EV fleet and participating in a low carbon fuel program, carbon accounting and reporting, and a greater share of supply chains, disclosure, decarbonization plans, climate change adaptation. And the reason why I wanted to share those is it's a lot of things. It's a lot of things. And to some of what we've been talking about today in terms of where do you start, curious, Melissa, Matt, if you only have to do 3 things in a year, like what's the mechanism to choose? Like where do you start? How does it fit within your business strategy?
Maybe I'll kick us off, Matt, and then you can jump in there. So, in Matt's earlier slides, he outlined a bit of a process, and that's how we tend to think of these things as well. Obviously it's not a one size fits all journey, but there are some, kind of key steps that you want to think through before. So, I mean, if you want to have a clear sense of the overall direction of, where you're headed. But then I think there's always value in spending a lot of time in that preparing your journey space. And so if I'm only doing a few things, it's in that bucket where I'm, planning ahead and really looking at ways to maximize opportunities. So, I mean, the one that sticks out for me is around scenario analysis. I think that there's a lot of value in that exercise, and it's a good time to do it. It's low risk, but it's very indicative of the types of risks that you might face. And so, you'd asked a question too about how that fits with overall business strategy. I mean, these are the kinds of issues that businesses are tackling anyway, within the context of a risk register. And so you're just kind of overlaying climate considerations on that, and it's often bringing to light business critical elements. So that's a key one for me. Matt, maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I would agree with everything you said. And I would say go back to when we think about business strategy, when we think about competitive strategy and meeting the market, you can go back to the classic models and tools that we always hear about, like, the 5 forces, Porter's 5 forces or whatever. But you can almost think about that diagram, those 5 forces, adding in some of the constraints of environment and climate into that, and emerging technology into that, as fundamental new forces that we can evaluate our business strategy against. So to me, it's not a question of how does this fit in with overall business strategy. It's how does it not? Like, when does it not? Because in most cases, it absolutely does. And if you leave it out, you're missing key opportunities and key risks to your business. So some of the work that we can do to better ensure that every decision package that's being made when that's being prepared going forward for executive approval or getting integrated into corporate strategic planning is actually asking a few key questions around climate and sustainability topics. Even if they're just high level qualitative, it helps decision makers understand the impact on strategy from day one.
So let's say we do those things. Like, what are some of the biggest or most common challenges or barriers that organizations face? Like, do they differ depending on the sector they're in? Are they common? Yeah, does it depend on how big they are? Like, what are we seeing? Either of you.
Maybe I'll jump on that one first, Melissa, and then you can follow up. I see a lot right now, even outside of the publicly traded company space, where we definitely see lots of challenges and barriers around disclosure and the transition from, sustainability reporting and disclosure historically being up through either HR or corporate affairs, public affairs, things like that, to sitting under the CFO. There's a lot of challenges in realigning culture for reporting and expectations around data and quality assurance and internal audit and all of that goes in there. That is obviously a bit more real for large publicly traded companies than it would be for smaller privately held companies. But the reality is the expectations of customers who might be publicly traded companies are driving that disclosure challenge into privately held companies that historically haven't had to talk about these things. So it is a common challenge that we're seeing across the board right now.
And I'll shift gears a bit, just given some of the work that I've been involved in lately, around some of the challenges that different companies are facing around net zero targets and interim target setting. So obviously a host of challenges. I mean, people are coming at it from different issues and have set these targets for various reasons, depending on their size and their suppliers and their culture and all of these kinds of things. And so in some cases, I think there was a rush to set these and maybe not the kind of foresight and thought that went into all of them. And you know, a bit of a moment where we're having this first round of interim target and kind of true up. And, you know, some folks are struggling with how to share where there's been shortcomings and how to share where they're having challenges and failures. And we've seen some really brave companies come forward and say, you know, we had hoped to do something, it's taking longer than we had intended. And, you know, and coming forward and being very, very transparent with that, and you know, consumers and the marketplace responding favorably to that kind of information. So a whole host of challenges with that, and something we're keeping a close eye on and supporting as well. And then Matt, you.
And on that, Melissa, like those challenges, being frank and open about those challenges is obviously very important. And it also has highlighted the very real situation that for many organizations, the reduction opportunities to reduce GHG footprint in today's economy are unfortunately few and far between at times. And so the options directly to reduce these things can be quite limited. And the pool of other ways to address it, either through offsets or credits or other kind of environmental attribute certificates in the technical lingo, are sometimes not accepted by different programs or frameworks when trying to meet targets and things like that. And that can be confusing and challenging to navigate, and can create a lot of uncertainty in you know, the minds of people looking to procure other ways to mitigate and address their carbon footprint. So you know, I'm optimistic to see that there is movement in this space, and there's some active conversations about, you know, better integrity of these products and their applicability after you've kind of exhausted other economic and technically feasible options. And so I'm hopeful that that's a barrier that can be lifted a little bit over the coming years.
So on that specifically, recently, you know, the Science Based Target Initiative changed direction on Scope 3 targets. How big of a deal is that? Just curious, like, is that going to be game changing? Is it just playing at the margins? Yeah, it seemed like it was a big deal when it happened.
I think the devil is in the details. It has the potential to be game changing for sure. It could completely open up the market for voluntary carbon in a huge way, which is why the likes of organizations like IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association, has been a really strong advocate for inclusion of these kinds of products in these conversations. But it also has the potential to create some challenges in terms of greenwashing and perception and climate action, in terms of directing dollars to the most rapid and optimal ways to reduce the emissions across our global economy. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to figure out the right way to implement it.
Right. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our time, and so I did want to thank everyone for participating, for showing up to our webinar today, asking some good questions, providing some feedback in our polls. Especially, I'd like to thank Matt and Melissa for bringing their expertise to bear. This feels like scratching the surface. So really, if people have further questions, or if they want to have a chat, you know, we'd be happy to. I think we can probably share some emails to be able to do that. There'll be, I think, a recording of this. So there are emails. You're welcome to reach out. There'll be a recording of the webinar that will be shared with everyone who registered. Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating everyday new development field to be in, and we're all in this together, really. I think it's how we get there is by working together to do better and also to understand what's happening. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have other questions. I want to wish you a great rest of your day and thank you, everyone.